transmission.
Доброго дня.
Hello to everyone. My name is Pavlo Smytsnyuk. I'm director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies at the Ukrainian Catholic University, and I'm happy to welcome you to this second session dedicated to the international humanitarian law. The lecture will be delivered by professor and priest at the same time, Afonso Seixas-Nunes. Professor Seixas-Nunes is professor at the Faculty of Law at St. Louis University, based in the United States. Before that, he was a fellow of the Blavatnik School at Oxford University, at the University of Oxford. Also, he is a visiting professor at the Portuguese Catholic University, there at the Faculty of Law in Lisbon, and he himself is originally from Portugal. Afonso combines in one his legal expertise and some religious or ethical approach to war, because he is also a Jesuit priest. To be able to listen to this lecture in Ukrainian, because our speaker will be speaking English, at the bottom menu, please select button interpretation and select Ukrainian.
In English, please go to the interpretation button on the below menu on Zoom and choose English. Okay, Afonso, the floor is yours, and we are happy that you are with us today.
Thank you. So good morning to you all. I couldn't understand anything, but I understood that you were talking about me. I hope that Pavlo didn't criticize myself, but we never know. So
Afonso, I'm sorry, if you didn't understood what I said, it means that you didn't choose
Afonso,
English.
can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Well, so
Afonso, can you hear me now? The interpreter is speaking to you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay, done. Okay. So good morning to you all, and I will begin by apologizing for the last lecture that, well, I had a problem with my knee and I went to hospital and I couldn't attend, and I was unable to send an email explaining that I couldn't attend. So in order to prepare today's presentation, which will focus on the laws of war, Pavlo raised my attention for this very recent report by Amnesty International that in certain ways criticized the way how Ukrainian combatants are performing the military operations. So I tried to read it very quickly last night and to see what is going on with this report. And I know that the director of Amnesty International in Ukraine has resigned her position since she doesn't agree with the content of the report. But since we have this report, I prepared today's presentation, so I was changing since last night a bit our the PowerPoint in order to address some of the questions that are raised in the report, in order to help you how to understand how those considerations can be made. A second point that I would like also to say is that it's impossible for me to say if this report is accurate or not accurate, since it all depends on evidence that was gathered on the ground, and I don't have access to that evidence. And so it's very difficult to say if the report is 100% accurate, or if actually there is a Russian influence behind the report, as the director of Amnesty International in Ukraine accuses the report of. So on this note, I will share my screen with my PowerPoint. Here we go. Because can you see it? Yeah, right. Okay. So in order to address here the questions of today. So just to make the link between this today's presentation and the last one. So the last one, we looked very much to the problems of use of force among states and how the use of force is forbidden by international law. So states cannot make use of armed forces in their relationships, except into situations when the Security Council declares a situation of threat to security and international peace, or when a state is victim of an armed attack and replies in self-defense. So on this front, we said that Russia invades and violates Article 2.4 in the sense it violates the rule on prohibition of use of force. The Security Council tries to deal with this problem, but as you know, Russia has vetoed any resolution, so the Security Council could not react to this invasion by the Russian Federation. And but nevertheless, Ukraine has the right under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter to reply in self-defense. We also look to the problem of how to understand the help that Ukraine is receiving from third states, such as the United States, Germany, UK, France, and many others, in terms of military equipment. So this is a right that Ukraine is entitled to ask for collective self-defense and ask for help of third states. However, these third states, as the President Biden made very clear, they do not want a direct confrontation with the Russian army, especially because I think there is the risk of a nuclear war, and nobody wants a nuclear war. So having said this, we can move to the laws of war. And when we move to the laws of war, the problem is another one, because we stop looking to who is right or who is wrong. So it doesn't matter when we move to the laws of war if Russia is entitled to invading Ukraine or not, or if Ukraine is the victim or the offender. What is important here is once a war has begun, an armed conflict, as we call it today, not so much war, but armed conflict, what are the rules that we're going to apply during the conflict? So, and it's very normal that people make confusion between these two branches of international law. But when we look to international humanitarian law or laws of war, is exactly the same thing. We are looking to how the states can conduct military operations. We do not look to the rightness of the invasion, of the rightness of who is wrong, who is right. So in order to go further in the laws of war or humanitarian law or laws of armed conflict, so there's several ways of designating this branch of law. There is something that we need to understand that is very difficult, I imagine, for people like the Ukrainian to understand these rules. But since the 16th century, basically, or since the beginning of humanity, the peoples tried to regulate how war was conducted. And of course, until today, there is a presumption, we call it presumption lotus, from a famous case that the Permanent Court of International Justice has decided in 1929, is that the states are sovereign and we cannot presume limitations to the sovereignty of the states except if they are regulated by international law. So in the specific area of war, of an armed conflict, states have freedom in how to operate their military operations, what kind of weapons they use, how they use them, and how they conduct hostilities, except, so they are free, except if there are norms of international law that put limits to those operations. So this is what the International Court has stated in a famous case about nuclear weapons, stating that the states they don't have an unlimited right to means and methods of war. But we have to understand that is a branch of law that will be always in tension, is the way I explain to my students, because in one side, the laws of war will try to protect civilians and civilian objects. So this will be very important to know who is a civilian and who is a combatant, and what is a military objective and what is a civilian object. So on one side, international law, the laws of war try to protect civilians and civilian objects. On the other side, this branch of law tried to regulate the right of states to conduct military operations. So it's always a branch of law in tension between protecting civilians and civilian objects and allowing states to pursue their military objectives. So, and in that sense, the first thing that we need to do is to classify the type of armed conflicts that we can have. And Ukraine raises here some issues. Of course, the conflict between Ukraine and the Russian Federation is an international armed conflict. A traditional international armed conflict is a conflict between two or more state parties. So in this case, we have Russian Federation versus Ukraine, so in international armed conflict. However, when the Russian Federation argues that the reason to intervene in Ukraine was the violations that the Ukrainian government was pursuing in the Donbas region, we could argue that there was a non-international armed conflict or an internal armed conflict between the central government of Ukraine and the region of Donbas. And that would raise lots of issues about non-state actors and if actually there were armed groups operating in Donbas under the effective control of Russia. But I will leave this question aside because it would get so complicated and complex to address these issues that I will address simply this conflict between Ukraine and Russia as an traditional international armed conflict. And in order to apply the laws of war, we look basically to two sources of law. The first, customary international law, which is a very important source of international law in the laws of war. So the practices that states have developed among them in order to regulate war, that the states have not put those rules in written, but they consider those rules as mandatory. So this is customary international law. And on the other side, we have treaty law. Treaties, so agreements and conventions signed by many states. on that sense, we will have as the major source of the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions. So when normally we hear in international news that Russia or Ukraine are violating Geneva law, we are referring to the laws of war that were ratified in 4 Geneva Conventions in 1949 and 2 additional protocols in 1977. So those are the conventions that regulate the laws of war plus customary international law. Okay, I will. I prepared a very full and detailed PowerPoint because the last time you asked for the PowerPoint. So there are some slides that can help you to explain a little bit more these distinctions. Although the distinction between international armed conflicts and non-international armed conflicts in somehow got blurred in the sense that the jurisprudence has considered that the rules that you apply to international armed conflicts apply nowadays also to non-international armed conflicts. So, and as I said, so the laws of war have as the central aim to protect civilians and civilian objects. So a very fundamental principle of international law is what we call I'm sorry, I'm just right. I'm just trying to put these down. Okay. So the one of the basic principles of the laws of war is the principle of distinction. So this principle will make the state parties to an armed conflict to distinguish who is a civilian, who is a combatant, what is a civilian object, what is a military object. So this principle of distinction that is always in the air, and as the report in Amnesty International refers, is at the center always of any armed conflict. State parties to an armed conflict cannot, and they are forbidden to attack directly civilians, as they are forbidden to attack directly civilian objects. The problem is how to define who is a combatant and who is a civilian, and what is a civilian object and what is a military objective. So normally when we look to and we're going now to look to the personal side of the principle of distinction, so looking to combatants and civilians. And of course, when we think about combatants, we think immediately, and rightly so, of the military forces of a state that are obliged to comply with a set of requirements, for instance, to wear uniforms, to be under responsible command, and to carry their weapons openly. So when we had the traditional wars between states in which both sides are clearly identified by their uniforms, by the vehicles they drive, etc., the questions would be very simple. So everybody that is wearing a uniform will be a combatant, and therefore they can be object of an attack. And people that were not wearing uniforms, they would be considered civilians. But as you know, and especially and so Article 43 basically it tells what I just described, that the combatant will be a member of the armed forces under responsible command and should carry their weapons or arms openly. So of
Afonso,
course,
I'm sorry, I don't know whether you are moving slides or not, but we see only the first slide.
Really? Oh, I'm moving. And now?
Okay, now we do see. So now we see classification of armed conflicts.
I was moving the wrong.
I don't know what. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
So here we are. is about distinction, and this is what I was talking about. So when we look to people wearing uniforms, it's very easy to identify. But nowadays, as you can imagine, with the emergence of non-state actors, or that what we call in ordinary language, the terrorist movements, the situation got really complicated, because nowadays you have, aside the military forces, you have also civilians that take upon arms. This situation will be very important in the situation of Ukraine for two reasons. First reason, when President Zelensky asks for civilians to take upon arms to fight the enemy. Secondly, when President Zelensky and the government of Ukraine teaches how to produce Molotov cocktails to civilians. So the question that emerges immediately is, first, those civilians that receive formal training and military training, I believe from what I read during 3 days, how to carry a weapon, how to defend themselves, how to shoot, etc. Are they civilians, or they lose their status as civilians, though they are not wearing uniforms sometimes? And then what happens also to those civilians who helped and prepared Molotov cocktails? And the situation, let's go here. The situation gets really, really complicated when we establish that a civilian is a person that is not allowed to participate directly in the hostilities. When a civilian participates directly in hostilities, he will lose his protection. And so, as you can see in your screen, so a civilian cannot be the object of an attack, but if you read paragraph 3, civilians shall enjoy the protection afforded by this section unless and for such time as they take a direct part in hostility. And so we're going to have basically two categories. We're going to have the category of civilians that have received that short military train by the formal Ukraine military forces. And we have these civilians that just prepared Molotov cocktails. So the first category, they will constitute what nowadays is considered a continuous combat function. So basically, all those civilians that accepted the invitation of President Zelensky to join the military forces of Ukraine and received training and start wearing uniforms or not, but they were carrying weapons and participating in the hostilities and were under the command of the Ukrainian military forces, they received a status called CCF. So they are now considered a civilian with continuous combat function. And therefore, they can also be object of an attack, and they do not enjoy the protection of civilians. And here is basically the description that the International Committee of the Red Cross has established of what can constitute a CCF. Another problem is what we call the DPH. So civilians directly participating in the hostilities. And in this sense, and here you have a profound debate between states about this category, because What the International Committee of the Red Cross has established is that a civilian that was asked or learned how to prepare a cocktail, a Molotov cocktail, is only a combatant or a DPH for the time that he uses that weapon and for the time he is preparing the weapon. After that moment, he recovers his condition as civilian. As you can imagine, this is a source of tremendous debate among states. For instance, the United States does not accept this distinction, and I presume Russia does not as well. Why? So imagine the following. So we have the Russian army get into Ukrainian territory, and they see civilians preparing these Molotov cocktails. How can the Russian army know if they are civilians or if they are combatants? Because during the time they are preparing a weapon and using it, they are combatants. They are DPH, so they are civilians directly participating in hostilities. And then if they leave the weapon and they stop doing it, they recover their status as civilian. So the United States criticized very much this distinction made by the International Committee of the Red Cross, because it says it's a revolving door argument. It's impossible in the conduct of hostilities for an army to have this level of precision in when applying the principle of distinction. So what happens with the US Army and also with the Russian Army is that once a civilian takes or participates in anyhow with the hostilities, even if he's only preparing a cocktail Molotov, even if he's not using it, he's just preparing the cocktail to give to another person, according to some armies, such as the American Army, and I believe the Russian Army as well, they will be considered combatants. And in this sense, all the Ukrainians that have joined the military formation or have prepared in somehow any kind of resistance against the Ukrainian army, against the Russian army, they will be considered combatants. And in this sense, I have to say that there was at the beginning some misinformation from the Ukrainian government, because when the Ukrainian government was informing the rest of the world about the number of victims, civilian victims, sometimes they were including in the number of civilians the people that are considered DPHs, that is, civilians that are helping in anyhow and in any way the Ukrainian military forces. And for the Russian Federation, those civilians that take arms in any situation, they will become subjects of an attack. So it's very important to have these distinctions in mind when we are talking about civilians, because only the civilians are object of protection. And now we go into the civilian objects and protected categories of objects. So a civilian object is any object that does not represent a military advantage to the enemy. So any object, if you notice how relative and ambiguous this definition is. So any object that does not represent a military advantage to the enemy. But within the category of civilian objects, there are protected civilian objects, such as schools, hospitals, religious buildings. So religious buildings, schools, and hospitals are within a special category of civilian objects. That is, in any situation, they cannot be targeted. So religious buildings or monuments or religious monuments, hospitals, schools, because they receive within the category of civilian objects a special protection. However, if you look to Article 52.2, you don't need to read it now, but you know, a lawyer needs always to support his arguments in the law. If in any situation those civilian objects and protected categories, that is, hospitals, schools, theaters, religious buildings, are used to protect the military forces of a party to the conflict, they become military objectives. Let's think. So, one of the accusations in the report of Amnesty International. So, according to the report of Amnesty International, and as I said at the beginning, it's impossible for me to see how accurate is the report because of the lack of evidence. But what the report describes is true, because I remember reading about this at the beginning. So the hospital is a protected civilian category and in any circumstances can be targeted, except if the use that is given to the hospital, and in the hospital we can include religious buildings, schools, and so on, is helping the military forces. According to what the Amnesty International report says, is that the hospital was at the same time being used as a place to keep weapons by the Ukrainian forces. So in these circumstances, the military commander of the Russian forces is called to make a judgment. He needs to think if the use or the location or the purpose that is being given to the hospital represents a definitive military advantage to the Russian forces. Okay, so let's put this very simple with an example. So we have the hospital, a maternity, women having children, people with cancer, people receiving treatment, soldiers that are wounded. Typical hospital, a hospital cannot be targeted in any circumstances. However, if the Ukrainian government, knowing that a hospital is a special protected category, uses that protection to keep their military equipment or to hide military forces, that hospital can become a military target if the army from Russia considers that targeting that hospital represents a definitive military advantage. So when the report of Amnesty International refers that actually the hospital was being used by the forces of Ukraine to hide forces or to hide military equipment, this raises a doubt about the civilian character of the hospital. And you may ask, so we have a doubt if the hospital was or not a military objective. Who decides this? Well, it decides basically in two parameters. The first is how many and what was the quality of military equipment being hidden in the hospital. If it was an important military equipment, if it was huge quantity of soldiers or huge quantity a huge quantity of military equipment, of course, and it's evident that the hospital becomes a military target. If it's not keeping huge numbers of soldiers or is not keeping important military equipment, that would be object of discussion. But as we have seen, the Russian forces are not available to big discussions or big discernments. So basically, and I'm going to be provocative, and then we can, in the moment of a Q&A of questions and answers, we can discuss this further. But if the Ukrainian military forces were naive enough to consider that the Russians would respect a hospital, they were really very naive, because the Russians are not respecting the most elementary rules of international law. But actually, if the Ukrainians have kept military forces and military equipment in that hospital, and hospital, I'll say also schools, and I say also religious buildings, so all those objects that are specially protected, they can be targeted. There is also well, there is a message here. Let's see. Oh, sorry. I can't read Ukrainian. So, so one of the aspects, the points that Amnesty International report highlights is the fact that they say that some schools were in very urban areas full of civilian population, or the theater, the hospital, and so on, but that the Ukrainians violate those norms. Let's be a little bit blunt. If that has happened, that is, if there was any military forces ordering schools to be used as military facilities.
Як написав в українську? Тут повинен бути переклад українською в англійську.
Pardon? I'm sorry. I lost that.
Я не почув, Юрію, що ви казали?
Sorry, Yuri, I didn't hear what you were saying.
Shall I repeat?
Я не знаю. Я знаю в Ютубе.
Okay, I think it's like internal discussions. Yes, they're having. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Shall I keep going?
Yes, keep going.
Okay. So, so what I was saying. So if actually there was the use of schools, religious buildings, hospitals by the Ukrainian forces, that cannot be considered easily a war crime. So when the international community is joining forces at the ICJ, so at the International Court of Justice, and press also the International Criminal Court for the violations of the laws of war, is true that if there is evidence that the Ukrainian forces have made this mistake, even if the Russian forces had used more force than they should, or something like that, that would not be considered a war crime. It would be actually considered responsibility of Ukraine, because it was Ukraine being violating the norms of war. Sorry. So civilian objects. And now the last part, because I think today probably we will have lots of questions, and so I want to raise the last part of this lecture. So how to conduct hostilities. So we have seen that we have civilian objects, we have civilians. Civilians can become combatants if they participate in the hostilities in a more permanent or sporadic way. And we have civilian objects, but civilian objects, if their use, location, purpose represents a definitive military advantage, they can be considered military targets. And if the forces of a country use protected buildings to hide military equipment or combatants, they will become also military targets. This is the principle of distinction. When we go to the conduct of hostilities, we need to look, because the Amnesty International also raised problems regarding indiscriminate attacks. So they accuse Russia of committing indiscriminate attacks, but they raise also questions how Ukrainian forces were behaving. So to look to the problem of indiscriminate attacks, we need to look at what you have in your screen regarding three questions. Basically, what is considered a lawful attack? So what is, not all the attacks are lawful, so what can be considered a lawful attack? Then the rules concerning the means of warfare, so the rules concerning the weapons that are being used by both sides. And then we have the third rule that is considered to the methods of attack. Let's begin with the third rule regarding the methods of attack. What would be an unlawful and a violation of methods of attack? Precisely what is coming to the news regarding, for instance, the Russian forces use rape and starvation as a method of warfare. So if they are not using the traditional use of force, in the sense they're not using weapons to kill people, but they are inflicting a level of harm like rape and torture and so on, and also starvation, which are war crimes. Even if they are not using directly force, they are using indirect methods that constitute war crimes. And in that sense, we can say that there is an indiscriminate attack or a violation of legitimate methods of warfare. Regarding the means of warfare and weapons that are being used, as far as my knowledge goes, and here I can open the door to new discoveries, but I haven't heard that both sides have violated this side of the laws of war. So the weapons that are being used by both sides are legitimate and allowed by international law. There is a problem of cluster munitions used by the Russian Federation. So the cluster munitions actually are forbidden by international law. There is a treaty that forbids cluster munitions, but the Russian Federation is not a state party of that convention, and it is very debatable if cluster munitions are forbidden under customary international law. So is it legitimate for the Russian Federation to use cluster munitions? I would say no, because I think there is already support to support that prohibition under customary international law. The rest of the weapons used, either supersonic, drones, and so on, they do not violate norms of international law. But now we have the problem of what can constitute a lawful attack. And so we're going to look to the rule of proportionality that you find on your screen. So the rules of proportionality, a violation of the rule of proportionality is considered an indiscriminate attack. And it's a rule that is up to the military commanders to respect. So when a military commander is deciding or planning on an attack, he needs to look if the military advantage direct military advantage that was anticipated by the military commander is not excessive regarding the collateral damage. I know this can sound very complicated, but I will give examples of how this is applicable in practice. So, for instance, hospital. Let's imagine the situation of hospital because it is referred in the Amnesty International report. So we have a protected building, a hospital. A hospital cannot be targeted, it's a protected building. However, the Ukrainian forces, let's accept this for now, as let's accept the possibility that the Ukrainian forces use the hospital to hide military equipment. Okay, we have a question if the hospital remains or not remains a military objective. However, the military commander, when he's about to decide an attack against the hospital, he needs to question himself if the military advantage that results from targeting the hospital is not excessive regarding the number of victims. So proportionality demands that the military commander is convinced that the military advantage that he would get from the attack is not excessive regarding the human cost of that attack. So this is a subjective judgment that falls under the responsibilities of the military commander. And now, how do we decide this? The judgment of proportionality is always considered by the international courts, and especially the former international court for, the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia had dealt very much with the principle of proportionality, and basically is the elephant in the room. Because let's take this example of the hospital that is referred in the report. You need to have such level of evidence to actually condemn a military commander of an indiscriminate attack for violations of rules of proportionality. Because if you say, well, they were hiding a missile, but the collateral damage would be 1,000 patients would die. In these circumstances, it's very evident that the military advantage would be clearly excessive to the collateral damage. But if you have 200 missiles and 1,000 patients, if you have an Ukrainian military commander or some Ukrainian soldiers hiding in the hospital, and imagine we have 50 soldiers and we have 1,000 patients, you start raising so many questions about proportionality that it's up to the judges actually looking to the evidence that both parties of the conflict give to the courts to decide if there was violations of proportionality. And let's give you some examples of other conflicts to see how difficult this was. For instance, when NATO bombarded a TV station in Sarajevo. So a TV station, civilian object, but NATO in the procedures was able to prove that the TV station was being used as the way for the Serbian forces to communicate with its soldiers. So when the TV station was destroyed, actually the court considered that since they were using, the government forces was using the TV station to communicate with their soldiers, that building would be transformed in a military target, because the government should know, the Serbian government should know, that they shouldn't take that building as a military, an object helping a conflict. Another problem is dual objects. For instance, the bombardment of a bridge, a very famous bridge in Iraq. And that bridge was used by the civilians to go to another location. That is, without that bridge, that population would be completely isolated. But that bridge, at the same time, was used by the Iraqi forces. So this is what we call dual objects. At the same time, they serve a civilian object, a civilian purpose, I'm sorry, and a military purpose. And these dual objects fall also under the judgment of the military commander if they can be targeted. And again, we apply the principle of proportionality. In the case of Iraq forces, actually the NATO forces were condemned for the destruction of a bridge, because the village would be in such level of isolation that would conduct, and as it did, the population to starvation. And so the court considered that in that situation, there was a violation of the norms of proportionality, because the military advantage anticipated was not, was clearly excessive regarding the collateral damage, I'm sorry, was clearly excessive regarding the military advantage that was anticipated. And with this, oh, sorry, oops, but, oh gosh, sorry. Share screen, what have I done? Sorry, what have I done to my PowerPoint? Here we go. Okay. No. Okay. Share. Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yeah? Yes. Okay, because it somehow it disappeared from my screen, but if you see it, it's fine. Okay, so let me summarize everything that I wanted to say. So basically, what is our problem? Our problem is laws of war. We do not look to who is right, who is wrong regarding the use of force. We depart from the point that once a conflict has begun, we need to regulate how the forces of both parties act on the battlefield. In that sense, we have the principle of distinction, and it's a mandatory rule that we distinguish civilians from combatants and civilian objects from military objects. We've seen how this distinction actually in practice get very blurred due to the reality of the new conflicts. And in that sense, the Ukrainian conflict is also an example how civilians have taken upon arms to defend their own territory. Then regarding the conduct of hostilities, we have the rule of proportionality that basically requires that the military advantage for one party of the conflict cannot be excessive regarding the collateral damage. So the effects of the attack cannot be excessive. That is a judgment, a subjective judgment that military commanders have to do. And then we looked also to the violations of rules regarding weapons and the problem of cluster munitions, and regarding some methods of attack that are also being used by Russia. To conclude, what can I say? And taking and now for a moment is in order to create discussion, let's take for a moment the report of Amnesty International as an accurate report. What are the consequences? The consequences are some, but they are not as devastating as some people might think. Why? Because maybe the tone of the report is not the best one. And in that sense, it can indicate that there is some Russian influence behind the report. But let's take the report as normal, as accurate. So in certain circumstances, such the attack to hospitals, the schools, etc., those attacks that would be considered clearly violations of laws of war and they would constitute war crimes would not be considered war crimes. However, this does not mean that Russia won't be forced to pay compensation to the Ukrainian government for the level of destruction that it caused. And also it does not mean that Russia has not committed many other war crimes that are not referred in the Amnesty International report. Namely, the information that we are getting from war crimes of sexual nature, use of torture, and so on. These are clearly war crimes. And also the crimes regarding the displacement of civilians. So the humanitarian corridors that were created that would address civilians to Russia instead of giving the freedom to civilians to go to another country that is not Russia is also a war crime. So in that sense, this report, from what I read, and as I said, I didn't have time to read the entire report, so I don't know exactly what they say, but I think there is the need to take this report with a pinch of salt, because is not excluding the responsibility of Russia regarding many other war crimes that are being committed. Secondly, let's see what other NGOs say on the ground, that are on the ground, about the accuracy of this report. And thirdly, has not affected until today the support of the other states. It's quite the opposite. The support of the Ukrainian fight is being increased by the rest of the world. Okay, so with this, I will stop and I will give the floor to questions if you agree.
Thank you very much, Afonso, for your presentation. As you may notice from the discussion, what you said has been discussed very widely. Now, there were a series of comments, and I think one of them is in English, so you can even read it and react. I don't know whether you want a while for reading it, and
it's only one that is in English, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And
so
others are rather comments, some pretty negative. But I think that the question that you have in English somehow, yes, represents the tone and the direction of questioning of those comments. Я попрошу перекладача, може перекласти ось це питання від Ольги Недавньої українською мовою.
Interpret this question into Ukrainian, which I will do.
I can address this question now, the one that is in English.
Yes, but wait a second until the interpreter translates the question from English into Ukrainian, so the other participants may understand what is going on. Yes, I think it represents pretty well the also many the comments by other people. Olha Wojciuk, Yuri Seixas-Nunes, Nenel Himich, etc. Yes, you can start answering, and I will also ask other participants to raise their questions, and if they have by raising their hand or by writing a question in the chat.
Right. So let's start. I understand the frustration, and it's and of course. Let's start with a simple example. So in this question, there's dear Mr. Professor Afonso. My name is not Afonso. I'm not Spanish. I'm Portuguese. So there is no L. Is this a problem? No. Is this a violation of the rules? Yes, because my name, there is no L. So what do I want to say with this example? Is that there is a clear distinction about emotions and about the suffering of the Ukrainian people and the laws of war. And as I said, when we are dealing with the laws of war, we do not look to the justice of the cause of the war. So we do not care if Russia is right or wrong, or if Ukraine is right or wrong. Is once a conflict begins, there is a new source, a new branch of law that is applicable to the conflict. So, and in that kind, in the way the conflict is done, both parties need to respect the laws of war. I'm not saying, and in nothing that I said, I'm saying that Ukraine is right or wrong. I'm just saying that if the report of Amnesty International is right in the weaknesses that they report regarding some procedures by the Ukrainian forces, those procedures will not constitute war crimes committed by Russia, because the Ukrainian forces need to know that their obligation is to protect their own civilians. And if they put weapons or soldiers in the hospital, they are putting their own civilians at danger. And so, and especially with an army such as the Russian that does not respect the basic elements of international law regarding the use of force, I believe if the report is right, and again, if the report is right, that actually the Ukrainian forces were naive to use protected civilian objects to hide soldiers or to hide weapons. Because imagine the following: Russian invades Ukraine, right? Absolutely wrong. Violation of basic norms of international law. We agree on that. But imagine that Ukraine had access to a nuclear bomb. Would Ukraine be entitled to use nuclear weapons against Russia just because Russia is on the wrong side? International humanitarian law and the laws of war will tell you no. Not all the means and methods of warfare are legitimate in spite of the rightness of the cause. So there is unique. I know that this is very simple and very easy for me to say because I'm not directly involved in the conflict, and you feel it as Ukrainians, and I understand that. And I sympathize with that, but I'm trying to tell you how the courts will deal with these questions and how the Russians, when they will face accusations, they will deal with this rationality. They won't care about the emotions of the Ukrainian people. So I'm just trying to address the questions from the objective legal point of view and to explain how international law of the laws of war operates and is very objective. Is the mission of the Ukrainian government to protect its own civilians, and using civilian objects or protected facilities to hide military equipment or soldiers puts its own civilians at risk, and it won't constitute crimes committed by Russia. I don't know if I was clear enough, and you know, it's not the first time I have these issues, because as the Jesuits in Portugal, we gave 2 houses to receive Ukrainians, and so this, while I was in Portugal before I arrived to the US, so these discussions with the Ukrainian people were always emerging, and it's not that we are not trying to help Ukraine. Of course we are, and what is going on is absolutely a nightmare. But I'm just dialoguing with the law, and the laws of war tells you what you can do and you cannot do. And if the report is right, there were some risks taken by the Ukrainian forces. That is up to the Ukrainian forces to judge. I don't know if there is any other.
Thank you, Afonso. So there are 2 other questions in the chat. One from Alexander Żabenko on the combatant commander's order. Я попрошу перекладача перекласти українською мовою питання від Олександра Жабенка.
Okay. Can I address?
Wait a second until the interpreter can translate the question from Alexander Żabenko is chat from the chat. And there are 2 other questions from Katerina Bodnar and Julia Komar, which will go later on. Okay. Afonso, I think you can start answering the question from Alexander Żabenko on the whose responsibility it is.
Sorry, I was trying to see.
Did you manage to find it?
Yeah. If the decision of the military commander is based on the wrong propaganda from his political and social high institutes, how is the responsibility distributed? Does the discursive character of many points lead to relativism? So very good question. So, so when we are talking about the Russian, any army, so we have a structure of command. So the military commanders obey to their governors, to President Putin and to the Ministry of Defense. And so they prepare and decide the plan based on what the government has told them to do. That is what a military commander does. So in that sense, the responsibility for the war and this propaganda that this question raises is a responsibility of President Putin. And now you can understand why there is the intention among many nations to create a special court for aggression. So aggression is a crime committed by the leader of a country. So it's a new crime that was amended in 2010, and nobody has been judged by the crime of aggression. So President Putin and his also entourage would be face responsibility for the crime of aggression, because it's precisely the kind of point that this gentleman is raising in his question. So that responsibility, the responsibility for a war of aggression, will be directly involved President Putin and the higher responsibles of the armed forces of Russia. Regarding the military commanders, so when we infer of the responsibility of the military commander, we look only to the rules of war that military commander might have violated. Example, for instance, if Russian soldiers have indeed committed the crime of rape, starvation, that would be direct responsibility of the military commander, because those kind of crimes happen on the battlefield and need to be under the supervision of the military commander. So if the military commander ordered it or knew about it and didn't do anything, or he should have known, the military commander will be responsible for all those crimes committed by his forces, and is not a direct responsibility of President Putin. In that sense, it will fall under the category of military commander. If it will lead all to relativism, I think actually that at this point, there is so many states and scholars and involved in the effort of protecting Ukraine that I think what we're going to find is precisely the opposite. For instance, the ICJ, so the International Court of Justice, in this case that the Ukrainian government put into the International Court of Justice regarding the violation of the Genocide Convention by the Russian forces, the court went beyond its authority. So it not only answered the question raised by the Ukrainian government saying that there were no facts indicating any crime of genocide, as the court took a position of condemning the war and ordering the Russian forces to stop immediately with this war. So the international institutions are so puzzled with this war in Ukraine that actually what we are facing now is precisely to absolute the kind of crimes that the Russian forces are committing. Now, there is an argument here, a second question. I'm sorry, I can't read the name in Ukrainian, but the question says, this is an unconvincing example with the imaginary example of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Everything is clear, the judgment will be made by our army and God. I was just raising an hypothetical example to explain what cannot be done. So and to explain the separation of two completely different branches of law. And regarding the judgment by the Ukrainian army and God, I will leave God aside for a moment, because the laws of war are the product of a tremendous effort by the Red Cross since the 19th century and the famous Battle of Solferino and then the Second World War, to put limits on states in the way they conduct their warfare. If Ukraine starts violating basic norms of international humanitarian law, actually erases also the judgment by other nations that can stop supporting the cause because Ukraine is losing the way of how war is conducted. So it's necessary to accept that actually, and I'm not making a statement, I'm just raising the possibility, if the Ukrainian forces use protected buildings to hide military equipment and or soldiers or whatever, the Ukrainian forces have put at risk their civilian population. This is like this. There's nothing that can be said about this. If it was a wrong judgment or a right judgment is not up to me to decide, because I don't have the evidence. I'm just looking to how the report is stating, and this report is what states read, and then we need to find evidence. But I know it's very difficult, but we need to have our minds clear that at the end of the day, it will be the law that will be applicable. And I think that is a very good principle of the gospel and of God, that when we are attacked by our enemies, we cannot answer with the same level of means and to identify ourselves with them. So let's not forget also the gospel if we raise the name of God in this equation. So just personal.
Дякую, дякую, Афонсо. Мені пригадується вислів Рене Жерара, так, франко-американського богослова.
French-American theologian who said once that war is like a tango. Your enemy forces you to dance according to the same rules, according to which he is dancing. I think that also poses a danger to Ukraine. We don't have to imitate Russia. We have to avoid imitating Russia and to fight the way Russia fights. I think this series of webinars is among the rest called to show us how we should not do and how we should not behave. Ukraine does not have to mirror Russia. We have to be different. We have a couple of more questions from Katerina Bodnar. She gave a question in Ukrainian and then translated it into Russian. Afonso, you can read the question from Katerina Bodnar in English.
Yeah. Is this how to evaluate nuclear blackmail? Is this the question you're mentioning?
You can read just the question that Katerina, or while perhaps Afonso, you read the question in English, I will read it in Ukrainian. Я зараз пропоную питання, як розцінювати ядерний шантаж з боку Росії в кейсі розміщення вогньових установок на електростанції Енергодарі, якими вони обстрілюють житлові квартали Нікополя. Виходить, що вогньовий захист Нікополя – це злочин для України. Як використання атомних енергостанцій буде вважатися злочином?
Right.
Афонсо, ти розумієш, про що йдеться?
Pardon?
В цьому питанні.
Pavlo is asking whether you understand the essence of this question. How to evaluate and so on.
So it's an interesting question, but has many questions within this question. So I'll try to address here different problems. So regarding the blackmail or this discourse used by Russia threatening other countries regarding nuclear weapons, I believe that this is what is being addressed here. I think the position of the foreign responsibles for other countries, so the the leaders of the other countries, at this point, we do not know. I haven't read anything in opposition of this, and I honestly believe that at this moment it's very difficult to imagine that President Putin would not use nuclear weapons if it would be necessary. Why? Because history tells us that dictators, and such as Hitler, for instance, such as Mussolini, such as the current president of North Korea or India, when they are crushed or questioned in their authority, they do not hesitate in using the most terrible means. And as you know, Hitler, at the end of the war, when he realized that he was losing the war, he lost completely his mind. And he sent his own children to the front of the battlefield, his children, I mean, German children. So I think that there is a very serious concern of the leaders of other countries of the possibility of nuclear weapons being used by Russia. And so it's not just the blackmail, it's a risk that other states do not know how to evaluate. The second part of the question is regarding a specific attack in Energodar. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, I'm sorry. So the use of incendiary weapons cannot be confused with nuclear weapons. So incendiary weapons are, depending on the kind of weapons that they use, they can be forbidden or not. And of course, the majority of these incendiary weapons are forbidden by international law, and so it would be and constitute a war crime. Regarding the use of nuclear weapons, and namely when Russia tried to conquer a nuclear facility responsible, where basically the energy of Ukraine depends on. So when we talk about nuclear facilities, we need to make a distinction between nuclear facilities that produce electricity, such as the case of that facility in Ukraine, and nuclear facilities that are connected directly with weaponry. And so it's true that the nuclear facility in itself represents a danger because of the structure of the nuclear facility. But as you know, regarding the facility that the Russians tried to invade, the International Agency for Nuclear Energy was telling that the Russians were complying with the requirements of protection that the nuclear facility demands. So in that sense, regarding the blackmail is something that the leaders of the other governments need to evaluate. And in this situation, I think my personal belief is that Putin would not, President Putin would not hesitate in using them. And he is the kind of president that he won't care if he sacrifices his own people. Second, regarding military, regarding incendiary weapons, we need to see what kind of incendiary weapons were used in this precise attack. And regarding the attack to nuclear facilities, in this case, from the information I had access to, the Russians were complying with the requirements that the nuclear facility requires in order to protect that facility. So in that sense. So now there is another question here. The whole system of international rules is designed for other people, not for such barbarians. Ukrainian does not violate anything, and God cannot be dismissed. Very good.
So we have some other questions from Roman Nebozhuk.
Right, but it's in Ukrainian, right?
In Ukrainian, I will read it, and the interpreter might translate it for you into English. Pytanie від Romana.
So the question from Roman Nebozhuk, I have got a question. In 2021, a law of Ukraine about the basics of national resistance was adopted. It envisages formation of the forces of territorial defense. Does this mean that all the civil population of Ukraine is under threat of attack as if they are combatants, volunteers? I don't know whether you would like to would like to explain. I am not sure whether Afonso knows the content of this law. Maybe you can explain in a couple of words. Well, in a couple of words, we had a right law adopted about the basics of popular defense, which envisages formation of defense units. There was a special law adopted and the special procedural law adopted by the Cabinet of Ministers that the volunteers can use rifles, hunting rifles, if they enter territorial defense units. And I think this saved our capital, Kyiv, in February and in the first days of war. Mm-hmm. From the point of view of international humanitarian law.
Mm-hmm. Right. So
this law for Ukraine, so the right to take a weapon and defend the country, but to what extent now the civilians are under threat of attack, because all the adult population can be considered potentially empowered with weapon warriors. So do we see any collision with international law? Because after the victory, we would like to have litigation with Russia, and Russia may use this argument against us. So which arguments can we produce stating that we have civil population and there is a law? And how can we avoid the situation when this law turns all the civil population into combatants?
The last question by Yuri Svestun, and we will end our webinar there, and the other questions you can raise in a couple of days at the last webinar. Afonso, the floor is yours.
So regarding this question, actually, it's a very valid and important question. I was thinking while I was listening to the translator in two levels of questions here and probably they are so entangled that it's really difficult for people to distinguish. It's one question is the moral question, the morality of this situation, and if the Ukrainian people has the right of self-defense against against Russia, I'm sorry. And I'm not looking to laws of international law. But actually, morality is very much received in the laws of war. And there is an article in the Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions that talks precisely about this problem. That is when the population, the civilian population, takes upon arms in a not organized way to defend their country against an aggressor. So the international law protects this right of civilians to take upon arms. So from what I understood, so I have no knowledge of this domestic legislation of Ukraine, but according to what the translator translated, so there is a law, a valid law, a legitimate, approved by the ministers and leaders of Ukraine, calling civilians to receive military formation and to take upon arms to defend their own territory. So I presume this law is constitutional under the Constitution of Ukraine, so that is not so relevant for international law. Pardon? So
absolutely, it's constitutional, he says.
Constitutional, so the government took this decision under constitutional law to call their civilians. Right, so the civilians that answered to this request from the government, and since it was constitutional, so the civilians that answered to this request, they lose their status as civilians, because as the government of Ukraine is asking those civilians to fight against the Russian forces. So when you fight, you lose your protection as civilians, because as the Geneva Conventions explain and the additional protocol, so the civilian shall not be object of an attack unless he participates in the hostilities. So those civilians is not all the civilians, is the civilians that answer to the request of the government. For instance, I don't know, children, I presume, are excluded from that request. I know that women have joined the armed forces, but the women that have not joined the armed forces, elderly people, everyone that didn't reply to that request are considered civilians. And however, this is important to say. For instance, imagine the following. So I'm an Ukrainian citizen and I answer to the request of my government. I receive military formation, I take upon arms, I defend my country. But if I keep going home to sleep and to rest in my residential house, where my family is, I'm putting my entire family at risk because I'm a combatant from the moment I take upon arms. And this needs to be informed by I don't know if it was, so I presume it was, but the Ukrainian forces leaders need to inform that once the civilians take upon arms, they cannot return to civilian residences. Otherwise, they will face the risk of those residences be transformed in military targets because of Article 52, because of the location in use that is given to that. So I presume that the advice I would give, if I can talk in these terms, is that the Ukrainian people that answer to this request, very legitimate from international and moral point of view, I think, need to live in different areas from the residential areas where civilians are living unprotected. So I hope I had answered the question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The last question, and then we will end, and you have 2 minutes for the answer. Afonso,
Yes.
From Юрій Свистун, прошу дати оцінку міжнародної судової перспективи
It's a
злочинів.
question from Yuri Svistun. Can you give, sorry, I cannot find this answer in written. Please evaluate from the point of view of international judgment perspective, the crimes committed in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, and other cities of Ukraine.
Okay, so now we are, so with this question, we are transiting to another branch of international law, which is international criminal law, which is like, it's not my expertise, but I will try to address. So regarding the theater in Mariupol, and so from what I heard, the theater is a monument, so from the beginning is already protected, and the theater was being used as a civilian shelter, and so even more protected. So it's already protected because it is a monument. Then the monument became a shelter for civilians, and there is no record that military forces from Ukraine were in that building. Apart from this fact, it was written in big letters, children, if I'm correct, and so that it could be seen from the air and from any computer or satellite that is used for the conduction of hostilities. So in this situation, the attack to the theater, if all these conditions that I said are proved to be true, as at this moment they are, is a massive killing of civilians. So it will be a very serious war crime that will not only responsible President Putin and his ministers, especially the Minister of Defense, but also the military commander that order such attack, as the soldiers. Why in this case is different? So we can have 3 different levels of responsibility for that attack, and this applies to other attacks. I'm just choosing the theater for being such an evident situation of violation of norms of warfare. So we have the responsibility of President Putin and ministers for the crime of aggression, military commander, war crime for ordering an attack that is unlawful and indiscriminate, and third, the soldiers. Why are the soldiers involved in this equation? Because according to modern international criminal law, when a soldier, and we are talking the soldier, even the lowest rank in the chain of command, so the most basic soldier, if a soldier receives an order that constitutes a war crime, the soldier cannot perform that act. So obedience to superiors is not an excuse in international criminal law. So any soldier that saw the word children on the floor and performed the attack by air, by land, whatever was the attack, is guilty of a war crime. And you can ask me, well, and if there was wrong information that among the civilians hidden in the theater were also military from Ukraine. If there was a doubt that the theater was a military object of civilian object, if there was a doubt, when there is a situation of doubt, the commander is obliged to suspend the attack. So if the soldier that received the order saw the word children that was impossible to ignore, and even if he received opposite orders, say, no, 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 we think that they are hiding military personnel in that theater. If there was not certain information, that is reliable information, the military commander had the obligation to suspend the attack. So in the case of the theater is one of those examples of I think the most horrible and evident situation of a total violation of norms of warfare, that the Russians can invoke the arguments they might find, that none will stand, because in that situation the Ukrainian forces did everything they could to respect the laws of war. And the fact that the word children was written in such big letters, able to be seen from anywhere, that raised the situation of doubt, and the attack should have been immediately suspended. So it makes liable not only President Putin as the military commander, as the soldiers that performed the attack by air and on the ground. Okay.
Дуже дякую. Дуже дякую.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Seixas-Nunes, for your lecture. Thank you for your comments and for creating this discussion. I would like also to make 3 brief comments pertaining to this seminar and this discussion, and then I would like to make 3 informational announcements. As a commentator, I would like to mention 3 things. Number 1, our wish as organizers to raise the level of our discussion from the level who is for Ukraine, who is against Ukraine, betrayal, victory, and so on and so forth, on a bit higher level, and see what are the demands, what are the requirements of the international humanitarian law towards Russia, towards Ukraine, towards both participants of this war. So we are now operating crimes and terms that come from the international humanitarian law. We talk about the crimes about humanity, about war crimes, about genocide. These are terms taken from special law, but we are not acquainted with this law. But I think until we start getting into details, we will still appeal to the moral law. And Professor Seixas-Nunes is not a specialist in Ukraine, but he's a specialist in the international humanitarian law, and he can explain this lexicology and the logic behind it. Secondly, I am grateful to Lyudmila Filipovich for her comment. Yes, we may not agree with what Afonso Seixas-Nunes says, but the way he thinks, in a dry, unemotional way, This is the way judges of international crime courts and tribunals, where Ukraine will appeal this is the way they will think, and this is the way the judges where Russia will appeal will think. That's why we need to pass this external view. We need to see how we are viewed by others, because otherwise we will remain living in our own bubble. And number three, there was a criticism addressed to the organizers of this event that we are sort of spreading Russian propaganda here. And I absolutely disagree with this reading. On the contrary, this series of webinar is an expression of our patriotism, and patriotism of our organizers. So a gesture of patriotism from our side is to defend our civilians. And civilians are Ukrainians, they are not Russians. These are Ukrainian residents. So our aim to protect civilians is a gesture of patriotism. We have the desire for Ukraine to have support from international community. This is our desire, and it is patriotic. Ukraine does have this support because truth and justice is on our side. And this is what Professor Afonso Seixas-Nunes said. If you want to continue this support, then you have to stick to the demands, the requirements that the international community has before the Ukrainian forces. And that's why we have to understand the preliminaries of this support. And if we understand this, we have more chances to have this support on and on. This is where I would like to round up with my comments. And now I would like to extend my gratitude to Professor Afonso Seixas-Nunes for his second lecture delivered to us. I also extend my gratitude to those who helped to organize this webinar, to the staff of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies, Iryna Kitura, who organized all this, also the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that is supporting our webinar. Also express my gratitude to Alina. Thank you very much for your translation in this emotionally tense situation. I also want to extend gratitude to all the participants for your comments, both positive, negative, for your feedback. This is also a way for Afonso Seixas-Nunes to understand, and for others through him to understand the lawyers who are looking at Ukraine, see and feel what the tensions, what the moods are in our society. This is also a way to feel it, and the way we can communicate our position to the international community. All your other questions you will be able to ask next time in our next webinar that will take place this week today, on Thursday at 6 p.m. by Kiev, 1800 by Kiev. So you are welcome again. So what we are doing is also a contribution to our victory. Have a nice evening. Thank you very much. And thank you, Pavlo, for moderating our meeting.